everybody. Today, Honey is going to continue reading Sideways Stories from Wayside School. Written by Ruth Shacker and illustrated by Tim Hout. Chapter 6. Bibi. Bibi was a girl with short brown hair, a little Bibi nose, totally tiny toes, and a big brown eyes. Her full name was Bibi Gunn. She was the fastest drawer in Mrs. Jules' class. She could draw a cat in less than 45 seconds, a dog less than 30, and a flower less than 8 seconds. But of course, Bibi never drew just one dog, or one cat, or one flower. Art was from 12:30 to 1:30. Why, in that time she could draw 50 cats, 100 flowers, 20 dogs, and several eggs or watermelons. It took her the same amount of time to draw a watermelon as an egg. Calvin sat next to Bibi. He didn't think he was very good at art. Why, it took him the whole period just to draw one airplane. So instead, he just helped Bibi. He was Bibi's assistant. As soon as Bibi could finish one masterpiece, Calvin would take it from her and set down a clean new sheet of paper. Whenever her crayon ran low, Calvin was ready with a new crayon. That way, Bibi didn't have to waste any time, and in return, Bibi would draw 5 or 6 airplanes for Calvin. It was 12:30, time for art. Bibi was ready. On her desk, there was a sheet of yellow construction paper. In her hand was a green crayon. Calvin was ready. He held a stack of paper and a box of crayons. "Ready, Bibi?" said Calvin. "Ready, Calvin," said Bibi. "Okay," said Mrs. Jules. "Time for art." She had hardly finished her sentence when Bibi had already drawn a picture of a leaf. Calvin took it from her and put another piece of paper down. "Red," called Bibi. Calvin handed Bibi a red crayon. "Blue," called Bibi. He gave her a blue crayon. They were quite a pair. Their teamwork was remarkable. Bibi drew pictures as fast as Calvin could pick up old paper and set down the new a fish, an apple, 3 cherries, bing, bing, bing. At 30, Mrs. Jules announced it. "Okay, class, art is over." Bibi dropped her crayon and fell over her desk. Calvin sighed and leaned back in his chair. He could hardly move. They had broken their old record. Bibi had drawn 378 pictures. They lay in a pile of Calvin's desk. Mrs. Jules walked by. "Calvin, did you draw all these pictures?" Calvin laughed. "No, I can't draw. Bibi drew them all." "Well then, what did you draw?" said Mrs. Jules. "I didn't draw anything," said Calvin. "Why not? Don't you like art?" said Mrs. Jules. "I love art," said Calvin. "That's why I didn't draw anything." Mrs. Jules did not understand. "It would have taken me the whole period just to draw one picture," said Calvin, "and Bibi would only have been able to draw 100 pictures. While with the two of us working together, she was able to draw 378 pictures. That's a lot more art." Bibi and Calvin shook hands. "No," said Mrs. Jules. "That isn't how you measure art. It isn't how many pictures you have, but you have good pictures are." Why, a person could spend his whole life just drawing one picture of a cat. But in that time, I'm sure Bibi could draw 1,000,000 cats. 2,000,000, said Bibi. Mrs. Jules continued. "But if that one picture is better than each of Bibi's 2,000,000, then that person had produced more art than Bibi." Bibi looked as she was going to cry. She picked up all the pictures from Calvin's desk and threw them in the garbage. Then she ran from the room. "I thought our pictures were good," said Calvin. He reached into the garbage pail and took out a crumped up picture of an airplane. Bibi walked outside to the playground. Louis, the yard teacher, spotted her. Where are you going? He asked. I'm going home to draw a picture of a cat, said Bibi. Will you bring it to school and show it to me tomorrow? Louis asked. Tomorrow, laughed Bibi. By tomorrow, I doubt I'll even finish with one whisker. Chapter 7. Calvin. Calvin had a big round face. Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, I want you to take this note to Miss Zerves for me. Miss Zerves? Yes, Miss Zerves, said Mrs. Jules. You know where she is, don't you? Yes, said Calvin. She's on the 19th story. That's right, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Take it to her. Calvin didn't move. Well, what are you waiting for? Said Mrs. Jules. She's on the 19th story, said Calvin. Yes, we have already established that fact, said Mrs. Jules. The 19th story, Calvin repeated. Yes, Calvin, the 19th story, said Mrs. Jules. Now take it to her before I lose my patience. But Mrs. Jules, said Calvin. Now, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules, unless you would rather go home on the kindergarten bus. Yes, ma'am, said Calvin. Slowly, he walked out of the door. Ha, 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 laughed Terence. Take it to the 19th story. Give it to Miss Jerves, hooted Myron. Have fun on the 19th story, called Jason. Calvin stood outside the door to the classroom. He didn't know where to go. As you know, when the builder built Wayside School, he accidentally built it sideways. But he also forgot to build the 19th story. He built the 18th and 20th, but no 19th. He said he was very sorry. There was also no Miss Zerves. Miss Zerves taught the class on the 19th story. Since there was no 19th story, there was no Miss Zerves. And besides that, as if Calvin didn't have enough problems, there was no note. Mrs. Jules had never given Calvin the note. Boy, this is just great, thought Calvin. Just great. I'm supposed to take a note that I don't have to a teacher who doesn't exist and who teaches on a story that was never built. He didn't know what to do. He walked down to the 18th story, then back up to the 20th, then back up to the 19th, then back up to the 20th. There was no 19th story. There never was a 19th story. And there never will be a 19th story. Calvin walked down to the administration office. He decided to put a note on Miss Zerves' mailbox, but there wasn't one of those either. That didn't bother Calvin too much. However, since he doesn't have a note, he looked out of the window and saw Louis, the yard teacher, shooting baskets. Louis will know what to do, he thought. Calvin went outside. Hey, Louis, Calvin called. Hey, Calvin, said Louis. He tossed him the basketball. Calvin dribbled up and took a shot. He missed. Louis tipped it in. Do you want to play a game? Louis asked. I don't have time, said Calvin. I have to deliver a note to Miss Zerves on the 19th story. Then what are you going to do? What are you going all the way down here? Louis asked. There is no 19th story, said Calvin. Then where is Miss Zerves? asked Louis. There is no Miss Zerves, said Calvin. What are you going to do with the note? Said Louis. There is no note, said Calvin. I understand, said Louis. That's good, said Calvin, because I sure don't. It is very simple, said Louis. You're not supposed to take no notes to no teachers. You already haven't done it. Calvin still didn't understand. I'll just have to tell Miss Jules that I couldn't deliver the note, he said. That's good, said Louis. The truth is always best. Besides, I don't think I understand what I said either. Calvin walked up the 30 flights upstairs to Mrs. Jules' class. Thank you very much, Calvin, said Mrs. Jules. Calvin said, Mrs. Jules interrupted him. That was a very important note, and I'm glad I was able to count on you. Yes, but you see, said Calvin, you delivered the note to Miss Zerves on the 19th story? Asked Jason. How did you do it? What do you mean, how did he do it? Said Mrs. Jules. He gave Miss Zerves the note. Some people, Jason, are responsible. But you see, Mrs. Jules, said Calvin, the note was very important, said Mrs. Jules. I told Miss Durst not to meet me for lunch. Don't worry, said Calvin, she won't. Good, said Mrs. Jules. I have a coffee can full of 2 cereal pops on my desk. You may help yourself to one, for being such a good messenger. Thanks, said Calvin, but really it was nothing. Myron. Myron had two Chapter 8. Myron. Myron had big ears. He had elected a class president. The children in Mrs. Jules' class expected him to be good president. Other presidents were good speakers. Myron was even better. He was a good listener. But he had a problem. He didn't know what a class president was supposed to do. So he asked, "What am I supposed to do?" "It's a difficult job," said Mrs. Jules, "but you can do it. You must turn the lights on every morning and turn them off at the end of the day." "What?" asked Myron. "As a class president, you must learn to listen," said Mrs. Jules. "I'll repeat myself only one more time. You must turn the lights on every morning." "I heard you the first time," said Myron. "It just doesn't sound like much of a job." "It certainly is," said Mrs. Jules. "Without light I can't teach and the children can't learn. Only you can give us light." "I think it's a very important job." "I guess so," said Myron. He didn't convinced. "Here, let me show you how to work a light switch," said Mrs. Jules. "I already know how," said Myron. "I've been turning lights on and off all my life." "Very good," said Mrs. Jules. "You'll take a fine president." Myron wanted to be the best president ever, but it was such an easy job, he thought, that anybody could do it. When school let out that day, Myron stayed behind. He turned out the lights by flicking the switch down. "Excellent," said Mrs. Jules. On his way home, Myron heard a horrible noise. First, there was a loud screeching, then a sharp squeal, a roaring engine, and then the very faint sound of a girl crying. Myron ran to see what happened. Dana was bent over the middle of the road. "What's the matter?" asked Myron. "My dog, Pussy, was hit by a car," Dana cried. "Who did it?" asked Myron. "I don't know," Dana sobbed. "They sped away." "Well, that's not important," said Myron. "We got to try to save Pussy." Pussy lay unconscious on the street. Myron carefully picked her up. He carried her 2 miles to the vet. Dana cried at his side. "Don't worry, Dana," said Myron. "She'll be all right." But he wasn't really so sure. He gave Pussy to the vet, walked Dana home, then walked home himself. Dana was so upset she forgot to thank him, but Myron didn't mind. He thought that was what being class president was all about. The next morning, before he went to school, Myron went to Dana's house. Pussy was there. She seemed all right. Dana patted her. Pussy licked her face. "See, Myron, she's all right," said Dana. "The vet said that you brought in her just in time." "Hi, Pussy," said Myron. He patted her. Pussy bit his hand. "I guess she doesn't know you," said Dana. "She was unconscious yesterday when you saved her life." Dana's mother put some medicine and a band-aid on Myron's head. Then she drove the children to school. They were late. They ran up the stairs to Mrs. Jules' class. The room was completely dark. "It's about time you got here, Myron," said Mrs. Jules. "We have no lights." "Why didn't somebody else just turn them on?" asked Myron. "Because you're the class president," said Mrs. Jules. "Show Stephen how to work the lights. From now on, he will be the class president." Myron showed Stephen how to turn on the lights. He flicked the switch up. At the end of the day, Myron showed Stephen how to turn the lights off. He flicked the switch down. After a week, Stephen finally caught on. He made a good president. The lights were on every morning. Myron, who was president for only a day, was the best president for the history of Wayside School. It was just nobody knew it. Chapter 9. Mauricia. Mauricia liked ice cream. She was sweet and pretty and could beat up any boy in Mrs. Joe's class. Everybody liked Mauricia except Kathy. But then she didn't like anybody. Mauricia only liked ice cream. Every day, Mauricia brought an ice cream cone to school and kept it in her desk until lunchtime. At first, she brought chocolate ice cream every day, but soon she was tired of chocolate ice cream, so she started bringing vanilla. But she got tired of vanilla too. Then she got tired of strawberry, fudge ripple, butter pecan, pistachio, Burberry cherry, in that order. And then a terrible thing happened. Mauricia got tired of ice cream. By that time, her desk was a mess, and everything in it was sticky. Everybody liked Mauricia, but Mauricia didn't like anything. Mrs. Jules hated to see Mauricia unhappy. I don't understand, Mrs. Jules, cried Mauricia. There aren't any good flavors anymore. So Mrs. Jules worked all night. The next day, she brought a new flavor of ice cream for Mauricia. It was Mauricia-flavored ice cream. Everybody will like it, said Mrs. Jules, because everybody likes Mauricia. Here you are, Mauricia, said Mrs. Jules. Mauricia-flavored ice cream. Everybody gathered around and Mauricia tasted it. They hoped she'd like it. Mauricia took a lick. Well, said Mrs. Jules, Mauricia took another lick. Well, asked the class. This ice cream has no taste, said Mauricia. It doesn't taste bad, but it doesn't taste good. It doesn't taste like anything at all. Mrs. Jules were heartbroken. Here, let me try it, said Todd. He tasted it. You're crazy, Mauricia, he said. This is the best tasting ice cream I've never eaten. Try some, Dee. It's delicious, said Dee. It's so sweet and creamy. She passed it around the room. Oh, it is so good, said Leslie. I think it tastes terrible, said Kathy. I don't understand this, said Mauricia. It don't taste a thing. Mrs. Jules slapped herself in the face. Oh, I made a big mistake, Mauricia. Of course you can't taste anything. It's Mauricia-flavored ice cream. It's the same taste you always taste when you're not tasting anything at all. So the next day, Mrs. Jules brought in Joe-flavored ice cream. Mauricia liked it, so did everybody else. Joe thought it had no taste. Everybody liked Mauricia. Mauricia only liked Joe. The following day, Mrs. Jules brought in Ron-flavored ice cream. Ron thought it had no taste, but everybody else loved it. Everybody liked Mauricia. Mauricia only liked Joe and Ron. By the end of the month, Mrs. Jules had brought in 27 new flavors of ice cream, each for one member of the class. Everybody liked Mauricia, and Mauricia liked everybody. They all tasted so good, all except Kathy. That is, Kathy-flavored ice cream tasted a little bit like old Borigina. Everybody still agreed that Mauricia-flavored ice cream was the best, except Mauricia. She liked the Todd ice cream the best. This turned out to be a problem. Every once in a while, Mauricia would try to take a bite out of Toad's arms in order to get that very special flavor. Chapter 10. Paul. Paul had the best seat in Mrs. Jules' class. He sat back of the room. It was the best seat and the furthest away from Mrs. Jules. Mrs. Jules was teaching the class about fractions. She drew a picture of pie on the blackboard. She cut the pie into 8 pieces. She explained that each pie was 1/8 of the pie. Paul never paid attention. He didn't see the picture of the pie. He didn't see anything. Well, he did see one thing. Actually, he saw 2 things. He saw Leslie 2 pigtails. Leslie sat in front of Paul. She had 2 long brown pigtails that reached all the way down to her wrist. Paul saw those pigtails. What a terrible urge came over him. He wanted to pull a pigtail. He wanted to wrap his fist around it, feel the hair between his fingers, and just yank. He thought it would also be fun to tie the pigtails together, or better yet, tie them to a chair. But most of all, he just wanted to pull one. Slowly he reached for one of the right. No! What am I doing? He thought. I'll only get into trouble. Paul had it made. He sat back of the room. He paid no attention to anyone, and nobody paid attention to him. But if he pulled a pigtail, it would be all over. Leslie would tell on him, and he'd become the center of attention. He sighed and slowly withdrew his arm. But Paul couldn't ignore those pigtails. There they were, dangling right in front of him, just begging to be pulled. He could close his eyes, but he couldn't make the pigtails disappear. He could still smell them and hear them. He could almost taste them. Maybe just a little tug, he thought. No, none. There they hung, easily within his reach. Well, let them just hang there, thought Paul. It would be foolish to pull one, no matter how tempting they were. None of the other children in the class pulled pigtails. Why should he? Of course, none of other children sat behind Leslie either. It was just a simple matter of being to think clearly. That was all. Paul thought it was over and decided not to pull one. It was simple as that. Suddenly his arm shot forward. He grabbed Leslie's right pigtail and yanked. "Ah!" screamed Leslie. Everybody looked at her. "Paul pulled my pigtail," she said. They all looked at Paul. I couldn't help it," said Paul. "You'd better learn to help it," said Mrs. George. She wrote Paul's name on the blackboard under the word discipline. "Tell Leslie you're sorry." "I'm sorry, Leslie," said Paul. "Humph," said Leslie. Paul felt horrible. Never again she would pull another pigtail, except there was one problem. He still wasn't satisfied. He had pulled the right one, but that wasn't enough. He wanted to pull the left one too. It was as though he heard a little voice coming from the pigtail saying, "Pull me, Paul, pull me." "I can't," Paul answered. "My name's already on the blackboard under the word discipline." "Big deal," said the pigtail. "Pull one." "No way," said Paul. "Never again." "Oh, come on, Paul, just a little tug," urged the pigtail. "What harm could we do?" "Lots of harm," said Paul. "Leslie will scream and I'll get into trouble again." "Boy, that's not fair," whined the pigtail. "You pulled the right one. Now it's my turn." "I know, but I can't," said Paul. "Sure you can," said the pigtail. "Just grab me and yank." "No," said Paul. "It's not right." "Sure it is, Paul," said the pigtail. "Pigtails are meant to be pulled. That's what they're here for." "Tell that to Leslie," said Paul. "Leslie won't mind," said the pigtail. "I promise." "I bet," said Paul. "Just like she didn't mind the last time." "You just didn't pull hard enough," said the pigtail. "Leslie likes us pulled real hard." Really? Cross my heart," said the pigtail. "The harder, the better." "Okay," said Paul. "But if you're lying?" "I promise," said the pigtail. Paul grabbed the left pigtail. It felt good in his hand. He pulled as hard as he could. "Ah!" screamed Leslie. Mrs. Jules asked, "Paul, did you pull Leslie's pigtail again?" "No," said Paul. "I pulled the other one." All the children laughed. "Are you trying to be funny?" said Mrs. Jules. "No," said Paul. "I was trying to be fair. I couldn't pull one not the other." The children laughed again. "Pigtails are meant to be pulled," Paul concluded. Miss Jules put a check next to Paul's name to a blackboard under the word discipline. But the last time, Paul was satisfied. True, his name was on the blackboard with a check to it, but that really didn't matter. All he had to do was stay out of trouble the rest of the day, and his name would be erased. It's easy to stay out of trouble when you have the best seat in the class. In fact, Paul could do this every day. He could pull Leslie's pigtails twice, and then stay out of trouble the rest of the day. There was nothing Leslie could do about it. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Leslie screamed, "Ah!" Mrs. Jules circled Paul's name and sent him home early on the kindergarten bus. Nobody would believe that he hadn't pulled Leslie's pigtail again.